And, and then I was also reading I love newspapers as a resource for research because that tells you so much about the stories of things that happened, and it fills in gaps, right? So you can read a letter or an interaction, and then you see, what are they talking about? And you can actually go to the newspaper, and it becomes clear. So so the digitization of newspapers, like I couldn't have written, any of my last 3 books in anything close to the time in which I wrote them were we not in this age of digitizing newspapers and archives. Although in her files, it was really, your pieces of paper, handwritten pieces of paper. Every once in a while I'd find an envelope that hadn't been opened that was in the back to see, what is this? And so it's a wonderful process of discovery. They make fun of me, and they said I became part of the staff at the library because I would drive up there every day from Philly to New York.
Hi, Carl.
Yeah. Yeah, they were tired of me. No, they were wonderful. But
to the Harbor Race excursion with the Oyster House.
Books really saved my life.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here. I'm so grateful to have met Imani already in the green room.
Yes.
And to get to spend an hour with you here. Just feel very fortunate. This book, Looking for Lorraine, if you haven't read it yet, you should read it. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
And you captured so well this beautiful portrait of an artist, an intellect, a historian, an activist. And someone who was so dedicated to the revolution. Mm-hmm. And I knew her only as a playwright. Mm-hmm. And I was astounded to see what an incredible impact that she made as an activist. And the way you write, I identified so closely with her as an artist and someone who sees injustice in the world and is trying to use art to try to change that. And the rage that comes with seeing injustice, the loneliness, the inspiration as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, you captured it so beautifully, and in that you also show us a beautiful insight into her depression and the weight of her isolation and loneliness. It's just so beautiful, and the thing I'm most excited about in this talk is also you took this quiet voice, actually very loud, ferocious, and very funny voice that we didn't really know about, and in giving it a platform and amplifying it, her voice couldn't be more relevant to now. Than it's as relevant now as it was back then.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you for this work.
Thank you.
And so before we get into all of that, I would love to just start and ask you about, just to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and where Looking for Lorraine sits in your body of work, and how is it the same or how is it different?
Yeah, so I, in some ways I identify with Lorraine in that I'm interested in many, many things and sort of am a bit all over the place. I mean, I'm trained as a legal historian and also a scholar of cultural studies and African American studies, and I work in a variety of areas, but if I were to sort of drill down to my primary concerns, one is the ways in which political concerns make their way into artistic production. And another is sort of trying to understand why, we are often in this dance of taking 3 steps forward and then 4 steps back, right, on questions of social justice. Mm-hmm. So those kind of are our primary animating concerns. To write this book was, in many ways, a transition for me. One of the ways I talk about it is that I wanted to move from writing more kind of traditionally academic writing that made people think, to writing that makes people both feel and think. And so I think of Lorraine writing her story provided an opportunity to get to the kind of emotional register of understanding that artists and intellectuals can create brilliant work, and they are still full human beings with complex inner lives and stories. And so wanting that my aspiration is that in writing the book that it would resonate with people, because there are aspects of notwithstanding how extraordinary she was, but of life that are universal, right? So there's, I think everybody who reads it has something to connect to, whether it is the experience of loneliness or depression, or sort of, or desire, or restlessness, or wanting, having this creative energy that's bubbling over, and So her story, for me, is both. It was necessary to tell because there just hadn't been that much written about her, despite how extraordinary she was. But it wasn't just about her. It's about what we can do with her life today. Yeah.
And her voice.
And her voice, which was extraordinary.
Yeah. And so, what drew you to her in the first place? How did you discover her? And what made you curious to even open up this box?
Yeah, so I can't remember a time where I didn't know about Lorraine Hansberry. My dad really loved her. I saw lots of productions of A Raisin in the Sun. I saw the film over and over again when I was a child. She was sort of like, I was raised by left-wing activists. My first time being in the newspaper, I was 3 years old at a protest against police brutality on the courthouse steps in Birmingham.
Yeah, you were. All right.
So that, so it gives you something of the context of my life. And so she was always sort of this important figure. But then before I started teaching at Princeton, I was on a fellowship there. And I was actually doing research on Paul Robeson's newspaper, Freedom. And I was in the microfiche room. And to be completely frank, Princeton has a really comfortable microfiche room. Like, I'd always hated microfiche machines, but it was so comfortable. I was like, oh, I'm going to become like a real historian now and be in all these little newspapers. And so I was reading Freedom, and I kept seeing her name. And I thought I knew...
As a writer.
As a writer.
Right.
And I thought I knew everything about Hansberry. I'd read everything I could possibly read. And then I found she was saying all these things. She was doing film criticism. She was talking about... the independence movement in Ghana. She was talking about women's organizing in the U.S. South, Black women's organizing, all these pieces, and I was like freshly intrigued by her, and that sort of to put me on the road to writing about her, because I also noticed, I started to think about, well, gee, her two closest friends, James Baldwin and Nina Simone, both have books upon books written about them. Right? We know they're iconic figures. And Lorraine was not in that mix, although she was really the central person for both of them. And they wrote about that a lot. So it sort of just pulled me. The story just pulled me, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. That relationship between those two, which I hope we get to, is phenomenal.
Yeah, it was really beautiful.
So before we get to that, let's take a step back. Let's set the scene, 1930s Chicago. So this is where Lorraine grows up.
Yes.
And what is this amazing moment in American history, actually?
Yeah.
The city, the time, the music, the culture, the intellectuals that she was surrounded by.
Right,
If you could just set us up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, millions upon millions of African Americans migrated from the Deep South to northern cities, Chicago, primary destination. Her parents were part of that group. She's the fourth child born to the family. And Chicago is both, there's this tension. So on the one hand, it's intensely segregated, it's intensely unequal, but it's this robust intellectual, artistic, political community. So the gospel music industry is there. The blues music industry is there. There are all these writers groups, some of them that came from the New Deal sort of writers groups and arts groups programs, and others that came from the Communist Party, which was active in Chicago. So there's this teeming, exciting world of Black arts and letters and ideas, and that's the milieu in which she came of age. And it is also, so that's the larger Chicago landscape. And then her personal experience is distinct because her parents were both college educated. It was unusual for migrants. And they existed in a world socially with many of the most prominent Black intellectuals and activists. And so she had people in her home who were thinking deeply about race and politics and, and how to strive towards freedom on a regular basis. So both the city And her family provided this really beautiful, nurturing terrain for a person who was going to become an artist and an intellectual. And at the same time, she's witnessing the depth of inequality every day. And both of those forces are important in shaping who she would become.
And so you also talk in the book about she's surrounded by all these elites, like
Yes.
like very intellectual, engaged, and
People.
her family's a middle-class family.
Yes.
But she lives with people who are not of the same class, and so
Yes.
straddling these two worlds, what impact does that have on her to live in this situation? And
Yeah.
real briefly, to tell the story of her parents
With the fur coat?
with the fur coat. I mean, what a scenario to be in.
Yeah.
What a confusing situation.
Yeah, so Lorraine's father is a real estate mogul. Her mother was a teacher and a ward leader, very involved in the city, in Republican politics in the city. And she is, middle-class Black Chicagoans lived alongside poor and working-class Black Chicagoans because Chicago was intensely segregated. They could not move out, by and large. So the classes are all together. And she gets a Christmas gift, and she's 6 or 7 years old, of a white fur coat. And this is in the midst of the Depression, and she hates it. And I talked to her best friend from elementary school a few weeks ago who was like, oh God, that coat, I think she wore it twice, right? It was so awful. And she said, and Lorraine said, I looked like a big stupid rabbit wearing that coat, and a hood and everything. And so she went to school, they sent her to school in this coat, and kids beat her up, which is not surprising, right? This is a moment where people are hungry. They're, desperate circumstances. And the thing that is so remarkable is that she understood, right? So she could have been, they're jealous, they hate, but she understood. Their feelings resonated within her, and that would be an ongoing characteristic for her. And she had incredible admiration for poor and working class Black kids on the south side of Chicago, because she said they weren't so concerned with being restrained and respectable. They would tell you, challenge you, tell you what they thought, and function with the kind of dignity that she admired. Right? That's who she felt connected to.
There's a moment in the book where you say she admired them because they
Fought back.
And she criticized a weak, compliant Black middle class whose elitism created a persistent tension with the rest of the Black community.
Yeah.
It was passive. It was, and rightfully so, it was trying to survive.
Yeah.
But she admired that the working class ability to fight back.
Yeah, and there's one story in high school where there's a protest, her high school, which was integrated, but not integrated in a limited fashion. The numbers, so the school board was not allowing that many Black kids to go to this school. It was a relatively good school. And eventually they realized they could no longer, they had to change the numbers of the school just because there were all these migrants, right? White students at the school began to protest, and they walked out. And so she recounts, she fictionalizes this event multiple times, but she recounts kids coming over. She went to Inglewood High School from Wendell Phillips, which was a largely poor Black high school. When they heard about the protests and the hostility coming from the white students, they said, well, those middle-class kids are not going to do anything, so we're going to go over there and, fight back for it. And that was just, so it was consistent with her feelings.
So if we could go a little bit more into her middle-class upbringing, because her father obviously plays a big role in this.
Yes.
He has a very specific job, which eventually, gives birth to the play, which she's really known for. So if you could talk a little bit about, his job, and also maybe a little bit about the court case that he won, because that plays a role later.
Sure. Yeah. He was a successful real estate entrepreneur, a mogul even, and because so much of Chicago was covered by restrictive covenants, which were legal contracts where people in communities would say, we agree we're not going to rent or sell to Black people. And so as a consequence, there's very limited area. The vast majority of the city was covered by restrictive covenants. And so he devised this plan where he would take he would buy a building and cut up what would be sort of 3 apartments and turn them into 9. And he'd put a little kitchenette in each unit. There's a hallway bathroom. So they were, not ideal conditions. So on the one hand, I spent a lot of time reading about the family in the Black press to get a sense of the public perception of them. And so he's called the Kitchenette King. He's not talked about critically because he is providing a service. And so, as we know, Raising the Sun takes place though in one of these kitchenette apartments, and you get a sense of Lorraine's sensitivity to what it meant to live in that type of environment and how crowded and uncomfortable kitchenette apartments were. And one of the other things Carl Hansberry did, in addition to being an entrepreneur, he was a civil rights activist of sorts, and so he wanted to open up more of the city to Black residents, so he purchased a home in a neighborhood that was covered by a restrictive covenant. They moved into the home, the family, the Hansberry family, and experienced a great deal of hostility, name-calling. A piece of cement is thrown through the window, narrowly missing Lorraine's head. It's and this was standard, violent responses all throughout the Midwest. I mean, Chicago is just one location where this frequently happened. And then they were forced by injunction to evacuate the property because of the restrictive covenant. And then the civil rights lawyers began to work with her father, litigating the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And he wins the right to occupy the house, although restrictive covenants were not declared unconstitutional at that period. That was 1940. The case, for American law students, everybody reads the Hansberry v. Lee case. Yeah. But it ultimately didn't resolve the problem of segregation. And I think that was important for Lorraine to witness too. She said, he followed this traditional path of the courts, and he won, but it didn't yield any transformation.
Yeah, and how powerful to see the injustice of that. Mm-hmm. And it really, later in the book, when she comes into her fire,
yes,
it's so clear that she's frustrated with the systems and keeps that fight back spirit and doesn't let up.
Yeah, yeah.
So before we go on a little bit any further, I want to talk about the process of this book.
Okay.
So, how do you dive in? So, for those of you who don't know, Lorraine Hansberry was followed by the FBI, given her political affiliations and the work that she does.
Yeah.
And you mentioned these FBI documents and the surveillance, and you even have them. So how do you get into all these documents, stories? What's it like? How do you choose what to follow? And I imagine you're opening up boxes of papers and stuff, and you think the story's here, and now you find something and the trail goes this way. How do you decide, and how do you get access to all this material?
Well, the access piece was made a lot easier by working at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, which has her papers, processed them. As a wonderful reference librarian who's now become a friend of mine was in charge of the Hansberry files. There's over 100 boxes, and I will say I did not anticipate that. So her archive only recently became open, and I think I was the first person, there were the two of us, me and a professor at Georgetown, who were in the files and going through every single box. And they also have all her books, so you go through the margin comments. But they also have other papers that are important, so I could cross-reference. So they have Baldwin's papers, at least a portion of them. They're not all available. Lots of her friends and interlocutors, Langston Hughes, who was one of her mentors, they are all there. So I could sort of follow the path of the relationship.
It's heavyweights that she's rolling with.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing.
Yeah, as a very young woman. The FBI file piece was interesting because it's accessible. I mean, there's some redactions.
Right.
But I could actually go online and read her file.
What?
Yeah, so that was, and then I was also reading I love newspapers as a resource for research because that tells you so much about the stories of things that happened, and it fills in gaps, right? So you can read a letter or an interaction, and then you see, what are they talking about? And you can actually go to the newspaper, and it becomes clear. So so the digitization of newspapers, I couldn't have written, any of my last 3 books in anything close to the time in which I wrote them were we not in this age of digitizing newspapers and archives. Although in her files, it was really, you're they're pieces of paper, handwritten pieces of paper. Every once in a while, I'd find an envelope that hadn't been opened that was in the back. I'd say, oh, what is this? And so it's a wonderful process of discovery. They make fun of me, and they said I became part of the staff at the library because I would drive up there every day from Philly to New York.
Hi, Carl.
Yeah.
Going in.
Yeah, they were tired of me. No, they're wonderful. But yeah.
So there's one piece, one object that you find. So Imani finds a yearbook, an old yearbook of Lorraine's.
Yeah.
And there's 2 instances in the book where you insert yourself.
Yeah.
In a very, very particular way. So as we learn later in the book, Lorraine was queer.
Yes.
And so in a yearbook, there's a dedication by a friend who has a very playful and
Yeah, so sweet.
it's so sweet and very let's say potentially insinuates a relationship. And you go, oh, but the name is scratched out. Is it E? Who are all the women with E's? I want to know. And then very, very clearly and deliberately, and this happens another time where you get to the same kind of situation, you distance yourself and say, look, I'm not here to judge. You don't say judge, but I'm not here to, as the biographer, I'm not going to invent or assume anything. So I'm not going to say anything about this because I don't know.
Yeah.
And you handle it with such precision, and I'm so curious why.
Yeah, so thank you. Because I was trying to be careful. A couple of years before the book came out, there was a forum about should we out Lorraine Hansberry. I wasn't on it, but I watched it. And Adrienne Rich in 1976 wrote a piece saying, will black feminists please write about Lorraine Hansberry's sexuality? So 1976. This book comes out in 2018, right? And so there were always these questions, and it seemed to me, once I was in her archives, like in the papers, it was clear there was no way to write a book, even a good book about just her work that didn't talk about her sexuality, because it was a theme in her writing, and not just her pseudonymous writing, which was when there were sort of really sort of lesbian-themed pieces, but in her other pieces as well. And so it was important to delve into. And then, you know, I wanted to be clear that I was trying to treat her as a full person, but I did not want to speculate on things that I could not know. And there are some pieces of her relationships that I did know, but I didn't include in the book because it felt too intrusive. You know, very intimate letters and things like that. But you know, this piece in the yearbook, and then some of the letters when she's in college with one of her close friends, they're just the romance. You know, it's so romantic and beautiful. And in her yearbook, like most of the people are like, you know, your locker is always junky. You never have any. Like it's like sort of teasing people, making fun of each other. And this was just so sweet and loving. And I thought, even if it were not like clearly a relationship, there's a romantic sensibility here that I thought was important for sort of putting into context the way she keeps sort of traveling and trying to find herself.
Yeah.
And the same, and you know, in the communication with her friend, I was partially kind of shaped by this dear friend of hers who said, so Lorraine's ex-husband and literary executor wrote this woman after Lorraine's death and said, you know, would you be willing to share the letters? And she's like, you know, they're really intimate. Like
Yeah,
it's
you
really
mentioned that.
right.
Yeah,
and so I actually followed her lead and saying, okay, well, I'm not going to press too far.
Yeah.
But there is something really important about this relationship, the way that they're talking about trying to find out what they want to do in the world, falling in love with the theater, right?
Yeah.
Falling in love with art. Those types of things were really, because I wanted a book that included the most profound relationships in her life, even if I couldn't sort of definitively state the nature of all of those relationships.
Yeah.
You know.
It's just so skillfully done. It pops out.
Thank you.
And it's just so, the way you're so careful and delicate about it, it really stands out as for your care for her story.
Thank
throughout.
you.
Yeah, it's really, I haven't seen a biography do that.
Thank you. That's lovely.
So, I mean, I have like pages here, so I'm conscious of time. So I'll jump a little bit.
Yes.
So Lorraine is growing up, she goes to college. She's not the best student.
No, she got a D in drama.
Yeah, I mean,
I love that. That's one of my favorite details of her life because I just think it's so important that we
Yeah.
understand that brilliance doesn't always come in the conventional ways, and it's not always recognized in schools.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I love that about her.
Yeah. And she's a crazy reader. She's hungry and
Voracious
searching.
reader, yeah.
And so she's finding a political voice. She ends up she goes to Mexico and really finds an amazing kind of opening there in this sort of
Yes.
artist community.
Yeah, she started out as a painter, and so she went and studied painting in Ajijic, Mexico, in this kind of like weird enclave of expatriates in Jalisco, and it's really beautiful. And there are people who've worked with Diego Rivera there. They're doing work that's like sort of modern art but blended with indigenous techniques, and she just absolutely loves it.
Yeah, and so she's her political kind of ideas are forming, her artistic ambitions are forming, and her first published piece is a piece called Flag
From a Kitchenette
from a
Window.
Kitchenette Window.
Yeah.
And why, could you speak a little bit about this piece that seems so unassuming, and the way you handle it in the book too, I loved, because I read it and I was like, oh, this is beautiful. Sure, I can aesthetically appreciate this, but then your analysis of it reveals this artist putting politics and art together in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, one, it's important because she's the child of the Kitchenette King. This is an indication, but also she's trying to grapple in that piece with the kind of second-class citizenship, the marginalization of Black Americans, in particular in the context of sort of being of the World War II generation, and in conversation with Gwendolyn Brooks, who was the most prominent Black poet to come out of Chicago, who'd written a poem called Kitchenette Building, which one of the things that bothers me a little bit about Lorraine is she didn't often recount or give credit to the influence of Gwendolyn Brooks on her work. But Gwendolyn Brooks' poem is really about the interior space of the kitchenette, and Hansberry's looks outward, right, about the location of African Americans in the body politic. And so it's almost like she's inspired by Brooks, but trying to do something different. And so it's interesting, when she gets to A Raisin in the Sun, she also goes to the interior, but is bringing this sort of social and political context. But it's a sign early that she's going to write about Chicago, that she's interested in the relationship between sort of interior space and larger politics and the social location of Black Americans.
Yeah, and what I loved your assessment too in there, you said she was always passionate about the subjects of the people who were looking out the window,
yes.
the oppressed, the poor, and looking through their eyes.
Yes.
And really situating herself in that struggle,
Yes.
which is a huge theme throughout her political life and her artistic life.
Yeah, all the way through.
So now we fast forward, we move to Harlem.
Yeah.
We're in Harlem now, so it's awesome.
Yes.
How does Harlem shape her? How does who she's surrounded by, again, like
Yeah.
heavyweights
Yeah.
in Harlem, and what does she find, and how does that shape her next phase of her life?
Yeah, so, she goes to Harlem and works on Freedom, which is Paul Robeson's newspaper. It's kind of left Black publication. And she's initially, hired to do mostly clerical work, and soon thereafter, the editor, Louis Burnham, realizes how brilliant she is, and so she starts writing articles, and he refers to her as the girl who can do everything, right? And she's involved in this world with people who are a generation older than her, who take her under their wing, right? So there are people in the Black theater world, like Alice Childress, who was a kind of extraordinary playwright, who would have been the first Black woman to have a play on Broadway, but for her unwillingness to change the play she wrote, Trouble in Mind.
So amazing.
Yeah, and so she really nurtured Lorraine into the world of Black theater. Then there's, W.E.B. Du Bois, who's like the most prominent scholar of the 20th century, maybe bar none. Paul Robeson, and Langston Hughes. So all of these people are around nurturing her, and she also kind of steps out into a public political arena. So she's there's a famous speaker's corner. For those of you who've seen the Malcolm X movie, and there's this sort of scene where he's standing on speaker's corner, Lorraine Hansberry would go there and just stand and give speeches on political issues, which was, standard, though not that common for young women to do. That she was in the thrall of that and working with the Labor Youth League, all these political organizations on a wide variety of issues around sort of social justice, politics, around the world, not really solely domestic and not even primarily domestic when she first started. And so it's like New York allows her to blossom.
Well, and what I love about it too is here she is, she's at the feet of Dubois, and like we said, she's not a good student, but he has her researching Kenya, the Congo, all these political revolutions and movements in Africa, and she's writing about them.
Yeah.
And so much to the point where there's a huge Supreme Court case in the schools that happens, and she's not paying attention to any of it.
No, the Brown v. Board of Education opinion, which declares school segregation unconstitutional, that's not of interest to her. She's talking about what's happening in Kenya with Jomo Kenyatta and the Mau Mau. And, and just a little bit for context, Du Bois is really the father of Pan-Africanism. He's the person who called the first Pan-African Congress. He winds up becoming an expatriate because he was ultimately so disgusted with the United States. He dies in exile in Ghana. I mean, he really is this global intellectual. And he mentored Lorraine's uncle, who was the father of African studies in American universities, a professor at Howard. So she is looking sort of broadly to questions. So she's primarily concerned with both economic inequality and race, but not simply in the domestic context.
You have this wonderful line that says, she was linked with a struggle that was invested in fighting against unjust exploitation of economic domination and for racial justice all over the world and at home. They weren't separate.
Yeah.
And her and that global kind of eye ends up taking her to this. One of my favorite stories in the book is she ends up in Montevideo in Uruguay because Paul Robeson can't travel. His passport's been taken.
Yeah.
And
he sends her.
And he sends her.
22-year-old, which was as an indication. I mean, sort of like Du Bois had her start teaching, right? So she was a college dropout several times over, and he decides to have her teach at the Jefferson School of Social Science. Du Bois has her, Robeson has her fly to Uruguay as a representative at this international peace conference, and so it's a sign of how much they nurtured her, but how extraordinary they thought she was. And so she tells the State Department that she's going to travel to Europe to get her passport. That's what she says, to get her passport, and then because the conference was declared illegal.
Right.
And she goes, and it's an extraordinary experience. She's welcomed to this community of mostly sort of organizers, largely from Latin America. She's invited to speak, not just delivered greetings from Robeson, but to offer reflections on gender and race. And then when they march in the streets together, the young people who are at the conference, the sort of closing event, she describes it as this unbelievably beautiful experience, marching arm in arm. Right, someone from Brazil on one arm, and someone from Argentina on the other arm, and it meant so much to her to be part of a community of shared commitments across the boundaries of nation state,
and that she was seen as a leader.
Yeah.
At 22, there's this detail, she's given roses after she's spoken.
Yeah.
I imagine, but in the way you tell it too, it's so beautiful. It's like you put us in her eyes, looking around, linking arms in arms, and seeing the faces of the police. And she says, I recognize those faces as back home, but we marched in defiance. And to have that power must have been incredible.
Yeah, it was life-changing.
Yeah.
And then she comes back home, and her passport is revoked.
That's right. FBI starts watching her. Her passport's taken away.
Yeah. So she's under surveillance for most of the 1950s.
Yeah. So let's change gears now.
Okay.
And she marries.
Yes.
If you could give us just a little bit of a snapshot about her marriage with Bobby, and just a little bit about how their relationship worked.
Yeah. So, Bobby was a Jewish communist graduate student at NYU. They met at a protest. That was their, they had, they were kindred spirits politically. Their correspondence shows that, there was some ambivalence on her part, even though I think she loved him quite deeply, but ambivalence that partially had to do with the fact that she wasn't queer in the sense of like a fluid sexuality. She really strongly identified as a lesbian. Mm-hmm. But they maintained, this incredible friendship even after they broke up. And they broke up after a couple of years, although the world thought they were still married, which was important for her. And he continued to facilitate all of her work. It's one of, you can hardly imagine another example of a woman, much less a black woman, in the 1950s who has a male partner who devotes himself to facilitating her genius and her work.
Uh-huh.
The center of gravity of the relationship was around her. He encouraged her to write. When she'd get frustrated and throw things away, he would take them out of the garbage can, spread them out, and tell her to start again. He sold a hit song. He was a songwriter as well as being an intellectual and a writer and other kinds of writing. And she stayed home to write, A Raisin in the Sun. And he also was her literary executor, so he is the person we have to thank for having all of the material we have. He maintained her papers beautifully.
And while it was rare for that situation to happen, one thing we haven't talked about that you described so well is she was so charming. Yes. Everybody is like, her smile brightened up the room. Yeah. Her wit, she was like a firecracker.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm sure anyone would fall desperately in love.
Charming and charming and charismatic and playful and goofy and all this. And I got an email a couple months ago from one of her classmates in high school who was just talking about what a sharp dresser she was. She loved clothes. He's like, she was really preppy and she was always put together and she was captivating. Yeah.
I just want to read. So the 2 days before they get married, mm-hmm. the couple is protesting. A Jewish couple has been sentenced to death. The Rosenbergs.
Yeah, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
They're sentenced to death because.
They're accused of selling secrets to Russians. And I'll just say as an aside, it's not in the book, but the third defendant, Morton Sobel, who was not executed, but was a very good friend of my father's. So this piece of the book, resonated deeply with me. As I grew up with Morton and the story of the Rosenbergs. So then coming to the story of the Rosenbergs in her story was one of the sort of numerous profound experiences. Yeah.
It's an amazing story because it just shows how even her life, everything was tied to the politics of the time. Mm-hmm. So this couple is sentenced to death. They protest, and Lorraine writes about her wedding, and it's so touching. I'm just going to read it. So we had come to a wedding. We had come to Chicago to lose ourselves in the bridal song. And then there were those moments when the news came. And we spoke of it quietly to one another, our voices soft under the discussion of where the cake would be placed and when the photographers would arrive. Our voices above the champagne glasses, our eyes questioning one another between the fresh, fragrant flowers in their gleaming pots on the coffee tables of the wedding house festive flowers. The Chicago heat in the vast living room suddenly overpowering the senses, some grim, terrible fire within suddenly making it more awful, more stifling. The desire to fling the glass into the flowers, to thrust one's arms into the air and run out of the house screaming at one's countrymen to come down out of the apartments, down from the houses, to get up from the television sets, from their dinner tables. The bride sits a moment in the corner, alone to herself. She thinks, and what shall I say to my children? And how shall I explain such a thing to them? Mm-hmm. And it's it couldn't be more relevant now to be celebrating this monumental occasion and to know that they're suffering, to know that there's political tension outside, and how do I deal with that?
Yeah, and I think the context of, the Cold War and McCarthyism and really the sort of overwhelmingly attack on the the left in the United States at that time period, and the blacklisting of people. And so she's deeply affected by what's happening, by the execution of the Rosenbergs and thinking about their children and the like. But it also is really instructive for two other things. One is she doesn't stop, right? So this doesn't terrify her or make her move away from politics. She goes in further, right? So it's a sign of her integrity. And then the other thing, which is a small thing, but which I thought was so interesting, is reading that on the one hand, and then seeing her wedding photo in the society pages, which, the sort of black society pages, right? So she's this she's like this bourgeois princess of black America on the one side, right? And on the other, she's this passionate radical, right? And that moment, right, to put the photograph alongside what's happening inside was it was such a profound moment for me.
That's a real common tension for her, right? The public life and the quietness. And you talk a lot about her loneliness and her depression and sadness.
Yeah.
Did that play a role in that? Was that what fostered it?
I mean, I think there's a sense of, I know, it's just a sort of an unrelenting sense of misfittedness. For example, her political friends did not know about her sexuality by and large. I speculate that Baldwin did, but I actually don't even know. But certainly the other activist friends didn't know about her sexuality. And then in her sort of circle of of lesbians living in Greenwich Village, that scene, overwhelmingly white women who were not politically engaged. So she wasn't, her whole self wasn't really there, right? And then there's this sort of coming from this elite class background, but also having come of age in Chicago South Side. So there's and then she becomes famous for Raising the Sun. So there's this constant sort of misfittedness. And actually one of the big things for me about what I learned in writing the book is that loneliness can coexist with really sort of deep, rewarding connections with other human beings, right? And so in being in her papers and Nina Simone's papers and James Baldwin's, they're all struggling with loneliness, even though they have each other, and even though they have lives that are really beautiful in many ways. And some of it has to do with the disposition of the artist, but some of it also has to do with the ways they were ahead of their time.
Yeah. There's this beautiful line. I can't remember if it's Lorraine or James Baldwin that says this. The thing that makes you exceptional, if you are at all, is the inevitability that the thing that makes you exceptional, if you are at all, is inevitably that which must also make you lonely.
Yeah.
Which is so beautiful. It's the struggle of this artist and their voice. She was so amazing in her observations of the world, but inevitably that's the thing that's going to make you so lonely.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I'm going to jump just a little bit ahead.
Okay.
How are we for time here? Are we at questions already? Another couple, has it been, oh my goodness. Okay, I need to jump ahead. Okay, bear with me. There's so much in this book. Okay.
You just have to bring me back.
I know you got to come back, or we can stay for longer. Okay, so she emerges this political voice. What do I want to get to? Okay, let's get to her friendship with James Baldwin and Nina Simone.
Yes.
Because these are three, as you mentioned, there's two heavyweights that transform the country and the history, and she is a huge part of that.
Yes.
And so maybe what's her relationship with James Baldwin?
Yeah, so it's interesting to read. So the relationship was really so profound that it manifested at a spiritual level. So he actually, before he meets Lorraine, has a dream about a woman whose spirit merges into his own, and it wakes him up, and he's overwhelmed, and and in retrospect understands that's Lorraine. This relationship is coming. She was one of his most passionate defenders. They discussed politics constantly. They fought. They drank together. They laughed together. They were. The words that people often used were down home together. So if you've ever listened to recordings of both of them, they do this sort of, highbrow elocution thing that
Yes.
was common, right, back then. But when they were together, they relaxed, right? They were vernacular. And there's these themes that appear over and over again in both of their works. They're both really concerned with the question of the legacy of fathers, the sort of
Yeah.
shadow of the father in the work. They are both struggling with questions of sort of the legacy of white supremacy and racism and how you get free from that. So you read their work together and you see all these conversations happening in the work in addition to the conversations they actually engage in together. Sometimes they're finishing each other's sentences and forms, and they're different, right? So Lorraine is much more ideological, right? Like she is a socialist, and Baldwin is not. Baldwin is just like, I'm just trying to tell the truth and
Yeah.
get people free. And yet, their ideas complement each other so beautifully. And he, was devastated. Losing her was devastating for him, and he couldn't even bring himself to come to the funeral. It was a really intimate friendship. And with Nina Simone, I'll just say really briefly, Lorraine brought her into political activism. So she's known, right, as this singer who was a civil rights singer, like the
Yeah.
voice of the movement. But that was not where she was, and she actually, she had performed at Carnegie Hall, and everybody was calling to praise her, and Lorraine called her and said, okay, so now what are you going to do for the movement?
Yeah.
And within a month, she's involved, right? And, Nina Simone would talk about as she taught her about political theory, about Marxism, about, Veblen, Thorstein Veblen, like all of these thinkers, so they had an intellectual relationship, a political relationship, and I also think Nina Simone inspired Lorraine to have more courage creatively, to be more experimental, because she was so brilliantly experimental in bridging classical music and jazz and blues and show tunes and all of that. So it's so both friendships were both creative relationships and political relationships.
I just want to read, for those of you who don't know, Nina wrote a very famous song called Young, Gifted, and Black, which came from Lorraine's writing and her speech. And it's quoted in here, and I think it's so important to read it just for what it means even still today. And it really speaks to her articulateness, her studies of African history, and her power for justice. Nina wanted to do something more for her dear girlfriend, and so she wrote the song titled Young, Gifted, and Black. Those were Lorraine's words. They came from a speech Lorraine delivered to a group of young writers. The nation needs your gifts. In it, Lorraine made a specific call to Black youth to embrace their identities and the struggle. Though it be a thrilling and marvelous thing to be merely young and gifted in such times, it is doubly so to be young, gifted, and Black. She told them, you are the product of a presently insurgent and historically vivacious and heroic culture, a culture of an indomitable will for freedom and aspiration to dignity. Like, so clear, so articulate, and so inspiring to a people who are in the midst of the struggle of our time.